Right, good morning. My name is Richard Olson. I'm helping to present this presentation alongside Lauren Mills. Lauren is an ex-journalist. She's worked from the Telegraph, the Independent on Sunday, the Mail on Sunday, the Financial Times, Sunday Times, and the Wall Street Journal, amongst other publications. The subject is, are you ready for a crisis? If not, you should be. This is all about how to create a communications or crisis communications plan even. So without further ado, I'm just going to move quickly on to a couple of slides just to tell you a bit about the service that we're offering. So this is a service, an advisory service that's provided to businesses within the Greater Peterborough, Greater Cambridgeshire, LEP area. And we are running a series of webinars, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Service is fully funded by the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Combined Authority and the Business Board. And we have local partnerships in place with the Cambridgeshire Chambers of Commerce, Federation of Small Businesses, the Institute of Directors, Make UK, as well as other local councils and other business organisations. So we have a team of business advisors with a huge range of knowledge, everything from HR, finance, marketing, import-export, warehousing, IP, R&D, tax, supply chain, etc. And we're running these series of webinars. Today, this is our fifth one. We've covered mental health, HR, layoff versus furlough, accessing finance, and the fifth one in the series is marketing crisis communications. We'll be doing ones on working on importing and exporting and foreign exchange implications, and a few others in the next few weeks. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Lauren Mills, and she will take us through this presentation.
Hello, good morning, everybody. The idea of this presentation is to ensure that you are as prepared as you can be in the event of a crisis happening. Basically, no company is immune to problems or mistakes and criticism. And though larger brands tend to get the most attention for their errors, all companies need to be prepared to address critics and crises. So this makes having an airtight crisis communication strategy more important than ever. So always have a plan. Simply being well prepared and having a rock solid strategy in place can dramatically minimize the impact of a crisis if and when it occurs. And more often than not, they do occur. So what you need to have in place is a set of procedures for dealing with issues such as customer service and complaints and product service problems and ex-employee frustrations and so on. These are more traditional problems, but if a crisis comes and whether your brand has made a mistake and is at fault or not, because of social media, these sorts of issues are now amplified by the amount of online discussion connecting people worldwide. And when it comes to digital marketing, make sure you have additional plans to address things like complaints in online review places such as Yelp, Google My Business and Facebook. And importantly, immediately address any false information about your brand that has gone viral. And don't be afraid to do this in the public domain on these websites. I always think that when companies say, let's take this private, that looks a bit dodgy. I think, as far as possible, conduct the conversation in the open and, go for maximum transparency because that builds trust. So the idea of this presentation is that we want to share our insights to guide you through the steps you need to take to create a crisis management plan and cope with the media attention that often follows in a crisis. So moving on, we thought we would have a look at defining a crisis. In this sense, it is basically any event, issue or situation that threatens to undermine your company's relationship with customers, suppliers, the public, any other stakeholders. It is an event which may have a negative financial or reputational impact on your business. And what happens next depends on how you handle it. So it's any event, issue or situation that threatens to undermine your company's relationship with customers and suppliers. And some examples are an on-site death or injury, breakdown of equipment, product contamination, which tends to automatically be announced by the regulators anyway, cyber attack and the hacking of client data. We've seen some terrible examples of that happening. Online complaints going viral, a fire or explosion at your site, human error, sending out misleading information and failing to perform a task in line with the client's instruction, failing to comply with an industry or regulatory standard, and also failing a regulatory spot test, leading to a full or partial closure of your business, and of course national disasters and indeed pandemics. We're going to move on now to take a look at a couple of examples that I shouldn't laugh, but to be honest, they are shocking examples of how not to handle crisis communications. And you'll probably remember back in 2010 that BP's oil rig, Deepwater Horizon, which was operated by Transocean, had a massive explosion off the Louisiana coast in the Gulf of Mexico. It killed 11 men, it injured 17 more, and caused a massive offshore oil spill, threatening the livelihoods of the Louisiana fishermen. It was a huge crisis. But it quickly became clear that BP, a company of that magnitude, had no crisis communications plan. What happened was that BP executives declared it was not their accident. They blamed their contractors and they made the company look arrogant and callous, and it just made BP look like it simply didn't care. The chief executive at the time was Tony Hayward, and he had no idea how to handle the media. He'd clearly never been media trained, and he made so many insensitive comments, including, bearing in mind that 11 men have died and there are families involved grieving, he said, "There's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back." Great. He was also criticised for taking a sailing holiday around the Isle of Wight during the crisis. He used to wander around the beaches of Louisiana in a starched shirt. It was so inappropriate. And worse still, irony of ironies, not about 6 months, I think, before the disaster, Hayward had fired most of the company's in-house PR teams to cut costs. That was a big mistake because the overall cost of this disaster is estimated to be around $146 billion. BP's original estimate was about $46 billion. So it was a costly mistake. And more recently, you'll probably be aware of the Boeing 737 MAX issue, and this is incredibly bad for the company. Despite 2 fatal crashes that killed 346 people, Boeing refused to ground its 737 MAX. And this has resulted in huge financial and massive reputational costs. 2 planes had literally fallen out of the sky and nosedived, killing these people. But it took 26 days for the Boeing chief exec, Dennis Muilenburg, to apologise. And he did this, I think very poorly advised, in a pre-recorded video sent out to social media. Now, not only was he criticised for the slow response, and indeed mixed messages he gave, which confused and frightened people, he failed to convey that he cared. A pre-recorded video distances him and also protects him really from any questions. What happened was that Boeing initially acknowledged that the plane's sensor had misfired in the same way on both of the doomed jets. But then, in the following weeks, the company defended the design of the plane and even blamed the pilots for not flying them properly. So people are genuinely worried about these planes. The delayed and confusing response led to allegations of a culture there which failed to listen to the concerns of pilots who'd already, said there are issues with this plane, an apparent focus on keeping them flying at all costs, and a tight-lipped approach to communication, which just isn't good. It basically transgressed many of the cardinal rules of crisis management, and it certainly has paid the price. According to its third quarter results last October, Boeing spent $8 billion responding to the crisis, and at that time had lost 1/6 of its market value since the grounding of its aircraft. So not good. But now we're going to take you on, we're going to cheer you up with an example of successful crisis PR. Now, this is a textbook example of how to get it right. It is just genius. You will remember in February 2018, I think it was, the fast food chain, and of course the main ingredient, chicken, is in its name, had to close, I think, 600 or 700 of its 900 UK restaurants after it switched delivery companies, and this led to a poultry shortage. Now, you'd have thought that is a massive PR disaster. How do we get over that? But no, within hours of the initial problems coming to light, customers knew exactly what had gone wrong, how it was being resolved, and importantly, when it would be fixed. And there was, unusually, but it was done very well, KFC used humour, which also conveyed empathy. It was brilliant. So what they did was they took out a full-page ad in the Sun and Metro newspapers. Now, the ad rearranges the letters of its name to spell out FCK on a chicken bucket. And the text below the image reads, "We're sorry, a chicken restaurant without any chicken, it's not ideal." KFC then continues by apologising, that's all-important apology, to the inconvenienced customers and thanking KFC employees. They said, "It's been a hell of a week, but we're making progress." Also, they put on social media a special website giving information about individual restaurants so that people knew if their local restaurant, when it would reopen. And the header of the site, the website was, "The chicken crossed the road, just not to our restaurants." It was a brilliant Twitter campaign using humour in a self-deprecating way that actually turned angry customers into empathetic ones. And it will be remembered as something that, in a sense, has really built its brand. It put up its hand, it said, "We messed up, this is what we're doing about it, and this is how much we care about you, the customer." So it was brilliant. We're going to move on now to think about crisis situations, the sort of 10 key rules that I think are important to bear in mind when you're faced with a crisis. And clearly what we've seen looking at BP, where a death or an injury, something major like this has happened, you must express sorrow, sympathy, before you say anything else. And remember that expressing regret and sorrow is not the same as accepting blame or responsibility. Where appropriate, promise rapid action, an internal inquiry to find out what went wrong and how to put it right for the future, what you're going to do. Never speculate on causes or blame. Don't blame anybody else. We can see how that backfired again on poor old Mr. Hayward. And however hard you're being pushed by stakeholders on the media, stick only to the facts that you know, and be clear about which ones you can and cannot disclose. There's likely to be a lot of rumours flying about, finger pointing, and that can be really intense. So be alert to mistaken perceptions, and if they happen, you've got to move swiftly to correct them. And where you have little to say, limit the time you spend answering questions. Don't ramble. Establish yourself as an authoritative source of information. This is really important because if you don't, then reporters will go to other sources which may not be as well informed as you and may mislead the public. And then you'll have to step in again to put things right. It's just not efficient and it doesn't look good. So be as helpful as you can and draw the line firmly when necessary. And a simple one here, if you're reading out a pre-prepared statement, just ensure that you finish reading it before you take any questions. Don't tolerate interruptions. It's just not acceptable. Make it clear you're going to read the statement and that you will then take questions. And remember, of course, that official investigations aren't in your hands. So you must not comment on them. And if they are ongoing, it's perfectly fine to say, we will update you once we have the results of the investigation. That would be the right thing to do. And among all this going on, you have to stay calm and courteous, as difficult as that may feel at the time. It's very important. And you could see, you know, going back to our examples, Tony Hayward found it very hard to stay calm and courteous. And actually, although Muhlenberg didn't do a bad job, he just failed to show that the company cared. And also, don't hide. Reporters, customers, the general public, they're going to want to know what has happened, what you're going to do about it, and importantly, and I can't really stress this enough, is how much you care. So we'll go on to look at some more things now. So I think it's a good idea just to try and give you some information about what exactly is a crisis communications plan. Basically, it's a set of guidelines used to prepare a business for an emergency or unexpected event. It focuses on the company's response to the incident and how it will communicate with its stakeholders. And companies that have a CMP in place are best prepared to ensure accurate information reaches employees, partners, customers, media, general public, any other valuable stakeholders, and in a timely manner. And most importantly, these plans guarantee a prompt release of accurate information, as well as keeping the message consistent on all company platforms. So here's a checklist of what your communications plan must include. It's a plan detailing as many possible crisis scenarios that you can think of, potential answers to difficult questions according to various scenarios. It's a good idea to get your crisis comms advisors to do this kind of thing for you, and then to have some media training, because going through those difficult questions and being put on the spot is very difficult, and having a practice and perhaps videoing it is a really good idea. It really helps people. Also, have a think about your communications logistics plan. This is all about who is permitted to say what. You probably need to anticipate the possibility of setting up an on-site crisis comms team or newsroom. I've certainly done that for clients in the past, and it is hugely comforting to them. And ensure you have a crisis communications PR toolkit. Now, this includes pre-prepared statements, press releases, email responses, social media responses, and so on. And if they're there, you can easily adapt them, of course, to whatever it is that is the crisis you are immediately dealing with. It's all about being prepared. And we're still talking about how we create a communications plan. This, first of all, is establishing the purpose of the plan. And it could be as simple as this. This plan creates a structure for communicating with internal and external stakeholders in the event of a crisis that affects the reputation or normal business functions of the company. Now, we all know how important it is to have goals for our businesses. It is equally important to have goals set out for your crisis communications plan. You need to set out the types of event that would elicit that plan coming into play. And when it does come into play, it will help you keep control of the story and restore normal business activity as quickly as possible. It's all about ensuring that the situation doesn't escalate. And if you've got that plan in place, you've got the best chance of avoiding that situation. We've talked about stakeholders. It's really important to have an exhaustive list of your stakeholders. Everybody you'd need to keep informed about the crisis, such as your employees, that's incredibly important, customers, partners, investors, media outlets, sometimes government, of course, and the general public. Think about your social media followers or people located nearby in the event of a location-based crisis. I had one client where their factory was based opposite a primary school and close to a church, and it was a very residential area around the industrial estate. All of these needed to be included as part of the plan. And it's so important to get all the contact information for each of these groups so they can be informed immediately, and consumer groups as well, where relevant. Good idea to create a hierarchy for sharing information on the crisis. So you need to identify the person or team that reports a crisis, that they need to know how they should share the information within the company. And that way, no matter who notices the crisis emerging, they will know who to go to first. So maybe they have to notify their line manager, who then notifies the CEO and head of comms or your PR agency. And the plan should also constitute information that should be disclosed to these parties. What information various people should be told at various times. Now, this might include known details about the crisis, the source of the incident, any immediate backlash, any safety measures that need to be put in place, whether the emergency services have been called, and so on. It differs for each type of business. Now, we've talked about the importance of having the facts of the matter, and I think it would be a good idea for all businesses, any shape and size, to assign people who have the responsibility for creating fact sheets about the crisis. Now, this might include everything that is known about the incident, such as, what it is, how it happened, what and who it affected, which parts of the business may have to close down and for how long, and what's being done to handle the crisis. The list should be constantly updated as new information becomes available. You can create templates for this kind of list, and again, that's something that your crisis comms advisor will be able to do for you, and it makes it much easier than to collate facts when you need to. Again, you need to be very certain about who is and who is not authorised to speak to the press. It's absolutely vital you assign people who have authority to speak to the media, likely to be the CEO, CFO, your head of PR, anyone else who is a specialist in your business. And it's really important they're comfortable communicators and appear human and caring. And again, this can all be dealt with through media training. It really can. So in identifying and assessing example crisis scenarios, it's very important to set aside a good chunk of time for your management and comms teams to brainstorm every incident they can think of and assess the likely impact on your business. And basically, you need to identify the questions, the answers, and create guidelines specific to social media, as we've already discussed. So I think we'll move on now to look at media relations during a crisis. Now, I think it's a good idea to know the journalist, if possible. This takes a bit of proactive work, but your PR people can help you on this. But a few tips to think about are: what publication does he or she work for, and what is its target audience? And what kind of piece are they writing? Is it news, a feature, and do they want to interview you about what's happened? And what aspect of what's happened do they want to cover? Get as much detail beforehand as you can. What do they want? It may be a single quote or something more. Check out the deadline. It may be helpful to supply background documents ahead of the interview, known facts, figures, etc. Have a think about what you know about the journalist. Are they straightforward and fair, as most of them are? Or are they hostile, have their own prejudices, or their own agenda? They may have a gripe against your company for some reason, for something that's happened before. Be aware. Does the journalist know anything about your company? And in this situation, please be patient if they don't, because in these days of stripped back newsrooms, somebody who doesn't cover business may be sent out to cover a business story and they just may know nothing. And I think it's important to be alert to their potential ignorance. Don't take it to be a slight on you or your company, but just help them and adapt to their knowledge. They're only doing their job, and they'll really appreciate that and give you a better time, I think. Limit the duration of the interview. You don't want to be giving long, rambling answers. And at the outset, it's a good idea to ask what the journalist hopes to achieve from the piece and who it's aimed at. If you're back in the office, make sure you've got someone to field the call. You don't want to be caught off guard by a journalist, particularly in a crisis situation. And it's absolutely fine to say, can't take the call at the moment, but I will call you back at an agreed time. What's really important is that you do call them back, because if you don't, they'll just go to someone else. And again, the truth of your story may get muddled. And ahead of the call, just collect your thoughts, be prepared, check with your PR advisor and crisis comms specialist, and just try and be as calm as possible, bearing in mind that this is your chance to show how much you care and what you're doing about the situation. I think we'll just have a think about some of the difficult questions. Now, this is quite interesting. All journalists know the rules of interviews, and too many people who get interviewed do not, and they get caught out. So rule one, for a journalist, there is no such thing as an out of bounds question, and you've got to be alert to this. They could ask you anything. They could go off on a complete tangent. So you're selling your house in the south of France. Does this mean your company is actually in trouble before this crisis hit you? It could be anything. But you have rights as well. Try and set the agenda and set the limits. And although journalists are used to confidently and expectantly asking difficult questions, it's often the case that they don't expect such queries to be answered. They're bold and they ask, but your job is to play the game as well as they can and stay within the limits of what you really want to say. So this goes on, I think, to, you're not obliged to answer. So the sorts of questions you really don't want to get drawn into, and you notice this happening all the time, or for example, on the BBC Today programme, you won't get politicians speaking about hypotheticals or predictions. With regards to businesses or anyone else, don't speak about anything outside your area of authority. It will really trip you up. And the no-go areas always for business leaders, I think, are comments about politics, rivals, customers and clients, ongoing investigations you can't comment on, or other organisations. And don't be afraid to say, I don't know. That's not something I deal with. And refer them to the expert in your firm. That's absolutely fine, not a problem. So, we thought you might like to hear a bit about preparing for a telephone interview. It's pretty straightforward, to be honest. Make sure you have the room to yourself. It's nice and quiet and you're not going to be interrupted for the duration of the call. Have all the facts in front of you in case you need to refer to them. Stay alert. This may sound crazy, but too many people just, wander off and slouch or read the online gossip columns. This is possibly your one chance to get your key message across. And it's part of your job. It's not something to be taken lightly. This is a professional person calling you, giving you the opportunity to put your side of the story across. And it's very important that it's regarded as part of your job. So also there's a bit about preparing for broadcast interviews. So if you're going to be on the telly, what is the program? You have a think about the audience. Who will be doing the interview? Is it going out live or pre-recorded? All of this you can find out, or your PR people can. How much of the interview are they likely to use? Who else are they interviewing? That's really important, because if you're being interviewed alone, that's one thing, but with other people, you need to find out who these people are and what their agenda may be. Now, in this kind of scenario, the use of notes may be limited because it's definitely not a good idea to read from a script. On radio, you can get away with having a handful of key messages and so on. But for TV, don't. It doesn't look professional. Now, if your office is the location for a TV interview, check the walls and the background for any inappropriate material. It could be anything. Just be really mindful of what the background is and turn off your mobile phone. Let's take a look at off the record. It's a term that I'm sure all of you have heard of. And there is this question about whether it really exists. I mean, when I was a journalist, it really did exist for me. And for me, it was part of building very trusted relationships with very senior business people. And I felt it was incredibly important to be trustworthy in that way. I think that because newsrooms have been stripped back so much, journalists are under so much pressure that it needs to be treated with the utmost caution. And unless you know and trust the journalist, assume that nothing you say is really off the record. It saddens me to say, really, but these days I think you have to assume everything you say may end up being published. And this is the same for giving background information. What I think that means and what it should mean is that a business leader is helping a journalist with the context that they can write, but certainly not attributing it to the person who's given the information. And it can work incredibly well for both sides. You've just got to be careful. And I think it's about how well you know the journalist and cultivating those relationships. I think it's incredibly important. So we're coming up now to the end, and thought, just reflecting on what we've talked about, I think, it's essential that companies of all sizes and across all sectors must have a crisis management plan. It's part of business continuity. It's absolutely essential. And you can see how you could get things wrong if you don't have one in place. It's important to set aside time to list all these possible crises that could affect your business and properly plan for them, and create a crisis communications plan and keep it up to date. Be clear on who's authorised to speak to the press and ensure they're media trained. And in this way, you will be best prepared for when a crisis strikes. So I think we're going on to questions.
Thanks very much for that, Lauren. That was really interesting. So I've got a couple of questions for you. Just in terms of a communication plan, you talked about keeping it up to date. What's a reasonable time period to keep it up to date? I mean, what will be changing? What's likely to be changing? What's the sort of scenarios at which you would look to update it?
Well, I think at the very least, it's got to be done quarterly with the management team. But also, you're assigned, the people you've assigned to keep an eye on what's going on in the business, your line managers, possibly the people who may be collecting facts, those people you've given that responsibility to, I think they should have an eye on what's going on every single day. And some companies actually promote whistleblowing, particularly in the financial sector, obviously highly regulated. And often there are signs up all over the office saying, if you see something that isn't quite right, you've got to speak up about it. So I think it's something you've got to be aware of every single day of your business, and at the very least, with your top management team and your comms people, review it every quarter.
The other things I've seen is, which seems to happen quite a bit, is that you get media training in for your staff, but due to the nature of your industry, your staff turn, and the staff who've been trained up, clearly have had the training, but they've then moved on to pastures new, people replace. You suddenly find yourself in a situation where actually there's probably one or maybe two people in the company who are media trained, and the requirements for media training are continuous almost. Is there a policy you should be doing? How should you be looking at it? What's your view on that particular issue?
Well, you should always have your top people, your identified spokespeople must be media trained. And if someone who has been media trained has left, you need to address that situation and consider whether somebody else, another specialist or a new CEO, whoever it may be, would need to have that media training so they're prepared. It's so obvious when someone has not been media trained.
Okay. The other thing is, actually one of the questions just been raised is that, we see politicians, and actually not just politicians, but people who make mistakes in public, in the public eye, not admitting to it, but trying to spin it. And, I think the view generally is that most of it can be seen through, but occasionally it isn't. What's your view on that? I mean, based on what you've said, it's almost an approach of actually you should be honest about it, but it doesn't tend to be the way, though, does it?
Well, it's not the way with politicians, but, political communications is a whole different area. Their teams are set up in a very different way. I mean, really, I'm talking about corporate business crisis communications. Mm-hmm. And this is a situation where you're dealing with customers and how it may affect your future financial and reputational position, pertinent to your profits at the end of the day. So that's why you do need to be honest and transparent. And the companies that are honest and transparent do the best. We can see through our examples that the ones that don't get hammered. I'm not sure that, I think it's going to take a very long time for anyone to get on a 737 MAX. Seriously.
Well, I think you mentioned to me that actually they had talked about rebadging it at one stage, or I think Donald Trump suggested they should rename the aircraft because that would get around the whole issue. Well, that's a possibility, and who knows, they might relaunch the 737 as a different plane and with a new name and not mention the 737 at all, and that's one way around it, I guess.
I think customers would see right through that. The journalists certainly would. And I don't think they get away with that. That would be seen as hiding and would further damage their reputation and their business.
Obviously, we're in a situation where currently we're in lockdown. It's proving quite interesting. One of the things you said about making sure in your room which isn't able to be interrupted. We saw a recent example on the BBC of a room which was interrupted during the middle of a live interview, and the person whose name I will keep quiet, turned around and berated his son for walking in, and then turned back to the camera and looked as if nothing had happened, which I think has gone viral in many regards. Obviously, situations like that, one assumes that, I think it's becoming the norm than anything else. I think interruptions do happen. It's just a fact of life. Whether it be your phone suddenly ring, as we had during one of our presentations this week, or something else happening, and how do you cover from that? You just accept it as it is, and what's your approach to that? I mean, especially in the live interview situation, it's different if it's being recorded, but in the live situation, it's a bit difficult to edit it out.
Well, it is. I think the example you're referring to was an absolute extreme. What can I say? Don't swear. Keep calm. If you need to ask someone to leave the room, do it calmly and politely. And I think that's acceptable.
Yeah. The other thing is that obviously crisis communications, everybody says, well, it's just for big companies, isn't it? Is there a view? Is there a size? What is it? How do you make sure you have something in place? Because it's like, well, I'm a one-man band. Do I really need it type approach? Or is it, I've got 50 staff. I haven't got anything in place for this sort of scenario. Who needs it? Who doesn't?
Everybody needs it. I mean, even if you're a sole trader, you might be a hairdresser, for example, and say you were doing highlights and for some reason the chemicals burnt your customer's scalp. They would likely go online and cause one hell of a fuss. And for a sole trader, that could be the end of their business. So having a plan in place and being able to respond to it calmly and, show empathy and how much you care and what you're going to do about it is essential. So I think it's anything from it's everybody, sole traders, all the way up to your FTSE hundreds and your global corporations.
But presumably the sort of breadth and depth of the plan will dramatically change. Be quite simple at a very small sole trader level, all the way through to a multinational. You can have quite complex with multiple teams, multiple people. You brought up a really interesting thing earlier on. You said about sometimes it's about who's answering that first question. We've had scenarios, which I remember in the past, where it's been a security guard on site who's answered the first question.
Yeah.
And they are, that is almost manna from heaven, I would guess, for a journalist, is when a security guard decides to answer all the questions on behalf of the company. Bear in mind, he's probably not actually employed by the company at all. He's actually a subcontractor.
Absolutely. And I've come across this when advising a pharmaceutical firm, actually. We decided that we had to bring in the receptionists because in the event of something happening, the journalists would be rushing through the door and trying to get past those receptionists. So we decided to media train them as well. Right. And also to brief the security team. It's really important that any potential breach, including security, if you've mentioned, are brought in on the situation or just simply told not to speak to the press. But with regard to the receptionists who were employees, we brought them in and trained them, and they really appreciated it because I think they felt quite nervous.
I suppose the other point is that actually some of the times you don't know who is calling up, do you? And it could be anybody calling up. And it could be a journalist who's calling. You have absolutely no understanding of who it might be.
Well, that's part of the communications plan, that you must ask who is calling, where they're calling from, why they're calling, establish those facts as part of your communications, crisis communications plan.
Okay. And I suppose the final point for me would be about the fact that obviously digital marketing, social media is huge now, and we see this happening all the time. A customer bad review, the viral comment that comes out, it gets amplified. It doesn't matter who your customer is, it happens all the time, and it's how you deal with it. And we see examples, as you said, I mean, probably more historically, they weren't social media related, but we see examples of companies like this all the time. And just not addressing it, sticking their heads in the sand, pretending it'll go away. And that's presumably a case of either not wanting to be proactive, not having a crisis PR plan in place. What do you think it is, and how do you think you address it?
Well, I think it is. I think a lot of companies and chief execs and so on are a little bit frightened of social media. And I think it's up to their advisors to reassure them, in a sense, not to be afraid of social media because it's with us and it's here to stay, but to be prepared for how to handle these comments.
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, all it is another form of media, but yes, it can go viral. Don't get panicked by it. Answer each question individually. Try not to say, let's carry on this conversation in private. Doesn't look good. It's all about don't hide.
Mm-hmm.
Be transparent. Show you care. Set up a new website that people can go to for information, or maybe a helpline that people can call if a company's gone into administration, for example. That's massively helpful. There are so many things you can do in so many scenarios that these need to be considered when you're creating your CMP. But overall, I think don't be afraid of social media. Just confront it in a calm, rational way. There was an example of a company, I'm just struggling to recall what it was, but the chief executive cancelled all, I've forgotten what it was, cancelled all business for a short period of time. Something bad had happened, and he phoned every individual affected, offering counselling for them and their families. And that showed such empathy. I'm sorry, I can't remember the name of the company, but approaching people individually as far as possible is a good idea. Putting a statement up on your website and directing people to where they can go to for more information and keeping that updated. But really, you do need someone who's monitoring the social media for you at this time.
It's probably one final point, but obviously, crisis communication plans, everybody's probably got one in place. They may or may not have updated it with COVID-19, but regardless of whether you're following government guidelines or not, a lot of the time there are people who are prone to go out there and complain, make negative comments about, for example, if you work in the construction industry, going and working on site, even though you follow government guidelines and government's keen to get you back to work, you can get some very negative press out of that. And I suppose it's the same circular questions, but how are you addressing those, and what are your customers typically looking to do in terms of driving those sort of that information out there? Because there's a lot of misinformation around, and the government's actually pretty good at spreading misinformation itself. And how do you overcome these barriers that about social distancing and about the ability they have to get back to work and not being seen to be the pariah out there spreading COVID-19?
Well, I think we're going to know more about this on Sunday when the Prime Minister announces his roadmap for how businesses do emerge from this down. And at the moment, if businesses are trading, they just need to make it very clear what they are doing with regards to their social distancing and what they're doing to look after their staff and their customers. Very important indeed. People want to know that companies are looking after their staff as well as looking after them. And I've noticed that a lot in recent weeks.
Great. Thank you very much, Lauren. Really appreciate your time this morning. Just to confirm that we do have other seminars coming up next week. It's on import-export and diversification. You can go to the website cpcabusinesssupport.co.uk/webinars to get in touch for a free one-to-one session with any of our business advisors. And please go to the same website /business-support, or you can email support@cpcabusinesssupport.co.uk. I'd like to thank you for attending, thank Lauren Mills for presenting today, and wish you all the best. Thanks very much.